Hello. Today we're going to look at Module 3 of the course. My name is Lucy Pickering. I'm from Texas A&M University of Commerce, and we're going to talk today about prosody and effective emotional responses. So what we're going to look at today is some aspects of what we call the linguistic penalty, which is the price that can be paid by some people who speak a variety of English in the workplace that is uncommon. Speaker hearers are often unaware of their emotional responses to intonational choices. Thus, negative responses are often attributed to non-prosody-based rationalizations. We think maybe this person is biased, or unfriendly, or angry, and so on. Awareness of how these phenomena take place may help us avoid penalizing speakers of non-prestige or non-standard varieties of English in the workplace. So we're going to develop the topic by starting to look at historical approaches to the investigation of intonation and affect or emotion. Then we're going to look at a newer approach with intonation as a grammatical system within the discourse pragmatic model. Then we'll look at the role of intonational miscues caused by the differences in perceptions of speaker hearers from different varieties of English and their emotional impact. And finally, we'll look at how this has been described as the linguistic penalty. So first of all, let's start with some definitions. We can start with the definition of prosody, which means patterns of stress, intonation, and rhythm in a language variety. Intonation is patterns of the pitch movement or contours and pitch prominences, the word that is stressed inside an utterance. So if you look at the diagram, on the first one, it says, "Where are you? Where are you?" And on the second one, it says, "Where are you? Where are you?" And the third one, "Where are you? Where are you?" The three different intonation patterns, all with a falling contour, but with different prominence points. Intonation cues are how we use these patterns, these contours and these prominence points as signals for interactional and informational intentions in our speak. And these differ in our speech, and these differ across varieties of English. Let's start by looking at some historical approaches to intonation and emotion, and then we can move on to what we're going to talk about in terms of tacit signals and cues. So there is a long history of intonation analysis in English, of describing intonation in terms of emotions and attitudes. That begins back with Henry Sweet in 1890, who said that the 5 tones of English could vary and indicate anything from an expectant or suspensive attitude to signaling a character of cheerfulness. This is the same on with Bloomfield in 1933. We use features of pitch very largely in the manner of gestures. We can talk harshly, caressingly, cheerfully. And also the great American intonation scholar Kenneth Pike in 1945 stated that intonational meaning modified the lexical meaning of a sentence and could give us attitudes that went from surprise or deliberation to mild detachment. This continued through the 1960s, most notably in teaching English as a second language with O'Connor and Arnold in 1961, who produced a very complicated lexicon of nearly 300 categories, carrying semantic labels such as soothing, reassuring, calmly patronizing, and other labels that students should learn. And continued with David Crystal, who did work in the 60s and 70s on different what we call nuclear tone types. For example, one kind of a falling tone could be considered conspiratorial. Another one might be grim or irritated or excited or pleased. Unfortunately, what happens here is that you get a very complex lexicon of intonational patterns that people, particularly learners of English, was supposed to be learning, and it was unclear if it was really true that these exact contours and prominence pitch points were lining up so well with specific emotions. So as an example, I'm going to show you a work that came out of a first project of emotion in speech at Leeds University that was run through 1994 and 1997. And we're going to look at some of the work from that from Richard Stibbard. So what they did was test this very question. Can you look at an intonational contour and pitch point and directly attach an emotion to that point or that contour in English? So he had some interesting starts. He looked out of the 5 or 6 basic emotions. Certainly there were a couple that we could attach certain prosodic choices to. For example, anger tended to have a high pitch, a high fundamental frequency. A wide pitch range tended to be louder and faster. Sadness tended to have a decreased pitch range, okay, a lower mean range of fundamental frequency and downward moving contours. But as soon as you got past some of these very clear and obvious basic emotions to try and work out how other things were being communicated, they really found a lot of problems. For example, Richard Stibbard includes disgust, when he looks at previous research on disgust in some projects is considered to have an increase in pitch, an increase in average fundamental frequency. At the same time, you can find research that's the exact opposite, that suggests that disgust has a decrease in mean fundamental frequency or pitch, right? So what I've done is show you on each of these, every time there's a little star, it means that what the research suggests is 2 very different things, right? So if we look at something like boredom and indifference, half the research suggests a low pitch level, a narrow pitch range, a slower than normal tempo. And then some of the research suggests the exact opposite, that there's a faster than normal tempo. Look at contempt, scorn, and hatred, for example, a lower than normal pitch level, a resonant voice quality. But then the other half of the research says that there's a narrow pitch range instead of a wide one, and that there's voicing irregularity, maybe whispering, which would be the opposite of a resonant voice. And finally, we have on here fear. Some research suggests an increased mean fundamental frequency, and others suggest a lower average fundamental frequency. So you can see there's a lot of disagreement. So why is it so difficult to get clear results when you're trying to connect specifically aspects of prosody with emotion? There's some reasons that we know. Few of the studies that we've talked about here use genuine data. They tend to use simulated emotions used by actors. There's virtually no work on stretches of longer speech. Often people are just asked to say one sentence in an angry way or in a sad way, whereas we know that emotions come out in prosody over a length of time. There's often a problem with baseline data. What is not angry speech or not sad speech? And thus there's a trade-off in realism and accurate measurement if you're trying to get people just to say single sentences. So the dynamic changes that we know occur in prosody across time are very difficult to assess inside a laboratory environment. And finally, we also know that emotions and affect is communicated by a lot of different things, not just vocal cues, but also what we would call paralinguistic cues, such as gesture and eye contact and facial expression. So, if this isn't necessarily the most productive way, it might be because speech sounds alone don't carry systematic, reliable cues. In other words, the vocal cues to emotional expression are more context-bound and specific to particular types of interaction. We intuitively understand that we're communicating some kind of affect or emotion, but in order to connect that directly to the linguistic signal, we have to look very carefully at the context itself. So what we're going to do now is look at a different approach, which in fact very specifically takes into account context and what's happening at any given time. So in this account, which is a pragmatic discourse-based account, intonational choices are seen as cues or signals to a speaker's meaning. These cues or signals are things that we have learned about the whole time we have been inside a speech community. So it's in light of a lifetime of background, of shared social and linguistic context together. What happens is that these cues become conventionalized choices which systematically are made in certain contexts. And we'll have a look at some examples of those in a second. And the context, the cues within the context, elicits an anticipated affective response in the hearer. For example, you see here a picture of two little girls disagreeing. What we tend to do as adults is use a rising tone to disagree in American or British English because it's less combative than using a falling tone. So we wouldn't say, no, you're wrong. We might say, well, you might be right, and that means you might be right, but I think you're wrong. Okay? So these are some of the examples that we would have a look at. Because we've been using these cues since we were very small, and we've been hearing and listening to them and using them, we're not very good at reflecting on how we might use them. Okay? We have an unconscious or tacit knowledge of norms or conventions, and we're often unable to verbalize them consciously. So when these conventions are broken, we often think that there's some other non-prosody related rationalization to explain why we are having an effective response to somebody's vocal cues. Maybe we think, as I said, they're angry, or there's some kind of bias or prejudice, and so on. So one way that we can investigate this as a research project is to look at miscues. Okay? So to say, in certain varieties of English, we have certain cues, vocal cues that mean certain things, and that if we miscue those things, what happens? What happens is that we have no time to reflect on those feelings, and hearers attempt to reconcile the cues inside the system that they understand. Okay? So if we look at something like intercultural or intervarietal communication, and we look at what we can identify as intonational miscues, we can see what the unexpected choice, what affective response that causes in hearers. So let's look at some examples. This first example from the workplace is an example of tone choice. So the rising or the falling of tones. And this is from John Gumpers in 1982. He investigated problems at actually the Heathrow airport. What was happening is there was incidents occurring in a cafeteria in the Heathrow airport in which Indian and Pakistani women were serving meals to British English-speaking population of cargo handlers. And they were being perceived as surly and uncooperative by these people. John Gumpers, who was an interactional sociolinguist, went into the cafeteria and observed these interactions and realized that one of the big problems was this different convention of using rising or falling tones. So, for example, when the Pakistani and Indian women were asking if you have a British English-speaking worker asking if you wanted gravy with your meal at the cafeteria, British English would say gravy, which would be interpreted as an offer. Would you like some gravy with your meal? Say yes or no. what was happening with the Indian and Pakistani women, where they were saying gravy, which was being interpreted as a demand. Do you want it or don't you want it? Okay, which was considered to be surly or rude. Okay. When this work was done with the Indian women, they understood reactions that they'd been getting all along that to them at that time had seemed incomprehensible, and that they had decided was prejudice against them. They also spontaneously recalled intonation patterns which had seemed strange to them when spoken by British English speakers as opposed to their Indian English variety. At the same time, supervisors learned that the women's falling intonation was their normal way of asking questions, and no rudeness or indifference was intended. So that's one example of interactional differences. And the way it works is the affective responses, the perceptions of the hearer, are that within their choice of intonation, the hearer has made a deliberate choice of contour, of a falling tone. And the affective response of that choice to a falling tone is negative, okay? The falling tone in and of itself is not necessarily negative everywhere, just in this particular context. In the context of being asked a question, the perception of the hearers is, why are you being so rude to me? Why are you asking a question to me in this way? Okay, so let's look at a second example where this time we're going to look at informational uses of intonation. One thing that we use in British or American and other inner circle Englishes is this idea of contrastive stress. So if you have a look at the example on your screen, this is a very simple example of a misheard phone number. So the American English speaker says, "Luke, what's your phone number?" Speaker Luke says 834-9578. The speaker gets it incorrect, 835-9578. No, 834-9578. And what you're listening for is that contrastive stress pattern on the incorrect digit. This is absolutely common in how we will speak to show what the prominence is. So what we asked Indian English speakers to do was the exact same task. And what you can see on your screen, in the first, the American speakers, this is 934-9578. So this is 934, and you see that rising pattern, 934. And then when he realizes it's incorrect, he says, no, 954, and he does a falling, a very strong falling intonation pattern. That strong falling intonation pattern in this context means that it's emphatic, right? That's the one that was incorrect, that you misheard. So we're going to do that again. When we did the same experiment with Indian English speakers, they gave the exact same intonation pattern every single time. 934, 934, 9578. So you can see from the contour pictures that this is the exact same pattern. There was no differentiation in contrastive stress. So what happens then if that happens? If the knowledge state projected by the speaker doesn't match that of the hearer, you have something called a high activation cost. So the hearer will be required to adjust their knowledge state retrospectively. In other words, they expect to hear a certain thing. They would expect to hear a contrastive stress on that digit. They don't hear it, so then they have to think again. This difficulty in processing the message requires hearers to replay parts of the message and can result in something Miriam Eisenstein has called listener irritation, which is a dual response with a negative cognitive reaction to reduced comprehensibility of the discourse and a negative emotional reaction due to the fact that you're feeling annoyed and distracted because you can't work out exactly what just happened, but it didn't go the way you expected. This can result in something that Bouchard has called a generalized negative effect. In other words, there is nothing wrong with the intonation in and of itself. It is differences in perceptions of intonation and what certain choices mean that are causing this negative affective reaction. Let's look at one more example. This is called prosodic matching. In this case, in English, in American or British English, if we are agreeing with someone, we match our pitch. Okay, so what you're seeing here is two speakers, one who has 3 prominent syllables and one who has 5. And the last prominence of the first speaker is matched by the first prominent syllable of the second speaker. This has been called pitch concord, prosodic matching, pitch matching. It all means the same thing. It's something that we do unconsciously, and it's part of our way to show agreement. If there's a mismatch, then you can see the differences in people's reactions. So in this case, what you have is a speaker saying, "Do you like grammar? You like grammar." And the Saudi Arabian speaker, the learner of English, saying, "No, no, 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 no." And what you're looking at on the top here is the difference in volume between speaker number 1 and speaker number 2. So there's no volume matching here. And then you're also looking at the difference in pitch. Here's the end of the pitch of the first speaker, and here's the pitch of the second speaker. So there's also no matching in pitch. This is something we call an emphatic mismatch. It is not something that generally happens between 2 adult speakers of traditional English when they disagree. It's too emphatic, and it makes you sound too angry. So it's these differences from learners of English, but also from speakers of different varieties of English, that we call the linguistic penalty. It's basically a price that you pay for having a different style of communication. Speakers of non-standard or non-prestige varieties of English, such as Indian English, are often penalized in the workplace when they don't even understand why that's happening to them. And often the people that are having these negative responses don't understand that this is a response from the intonation. Typically, these responses and the way we respond to these cues are below the waterline, essentially. And they're very powerful in transient events such as speech, because speech comes and speech goes. So what we've done here in this is show you through cross-varietal microanalysis how we can reason backward from context to suggest what role intonation and other prosodic cues can play in the affective responses of hearers to discourse. First, you can establish the intonational forms and norms that are used in any given variety. Then you can assess miscues, cues that are different from those conventional norms, and then you can assess their reaction. And through this, critical prosodic systems in discourse can be identified. In terms of the impact of the workplace, what we're looking for is to prevent any glass ceiling for promotion, where people are being assessed based on these varieties of norms and conventions that are different between them, but do not have any affective meaning that is expected by the hearer. Thank you.